So, I've been thinking a lot about the three remaining winless teams in the Overwatch League. Of course, I feel bad for anybody who supports either the Vancouver Titans, LA Valiant, or London Spitfire, but I find the situation to be very interesting. In the past 3 years, every team aside from the Season 1 Dragons had a win under their belts by their 8th game. Having this many winless teams 8 weeks into the season is highly unusual, so I thought we could have a discussion about their shortcomings, as well as who will win a game first and what I am deeming the great winless team race. Now, originally, all of this failure got me thinking about the What is Wrong with Your Team series, but I quickly realized that doing individual episodes for all these teams wouldn't make any sense. Sure, they all have their own problems, but in the grand scheme of things, they all share a lot of the same painful struggles, so I feel that it could have been boring to talk about all of them in their own dedicated episodes. They share a common theme, so might as well combine them all together. So yeah, this is technically episode 1 of the What is Wrong with Your Team series here in season 4. If you're new to this series, it's pretty simple. We identify why teams are struggling, and then we discuss potential ways for them to turn it around. And in this case, you get some bonus content as I'm going to be going over the likelihood of who wins first. We're going to take a look at their schedules and everything too. It'll be fun. Let's get down to business now. How about we begin with the LA Valiant? These boys have not been having fun. This team rushed to build a subpar roster after changing their management with little to no funds to work with and multiple players turning down offers. They were supposed to be bad, and, well, they are. They don't have much to work with at all. Every possible matchup in Asia puts them at a disadvantage. I mean, come on. There are glaring holes pretty much everywhere you can look. DPS is the only place they're halfway decent. Consider what's going on with their tank play. They pretty much can never play around their tank line ever. The only time where it feels like they can is when Shochang plays Zarya, and she's not that good of a hero right now, unfortunately. When Silver 3 plays Winston, for example, he gets blown up like every single time. When they put resources into him, all he can really manage to do is stay alive. He seems to fare a bit better on Wrecking Ball because he has the better mobility to escape the jaws of death, but with heroes like Winston and Orisa being a better meta pick, it makes it hard to get value. They probably could get away with running ball on control maps, which is something they have already done so, and they've been decent on it in my opinion. Along with that, they should really consider utilizing Orisa more. I really think it could help them in the long run. Paris decided to do this recently, and it worked wonders for them. Their tanks were staying up for way longer during fights, and keeping your main tank up makes a massive difference for all sorts of different reasons. You have better point presence, crowd control, and more space for your playmakers to do their thing. And I don't just mean the damage playmakers either. It works for the supports too. The less they have to heal their dead tanks every other second, the more they get to make meaningful plays of their own. WYA is a very capable flex support, but it's hard for him to show it when he's a heal bot 24/7. But of course, there are some other problems that require time to solve more than anything else. Like at main support, for example. Hybe has been unimpressive so far, but that should be expected when considering he was a tank player for his whole career up until this point. That's an example of needing to be patient. This is not his natural position, so naturally there's going to be a lot of mistakes. There's nothing you can really do about it. Ideally, it would be great if this team could sign another support player, but that probably will not happen given their situation. So all the Valiant can hope is that he continues to improve. In the meantime, they should continue to focus on their strengths, that being their DPS, plus Shochang from time to time. Crystal and Molanrun are seriously a decent duo. That's why I firmly believe that slowing down the pace using heavy barrier comps could work to their advantage. Keep yourself stable, play around the picks your DPS get because you know they're going to get some. It helps that Shochang was a serviceable Sigma back in his Contenders days too. It kind of amazes me that the Valiant aren't interested in trying these comps more. For all I know, they might be trying to practice them and using them during scrims and everything and they're just bad at them. But if that doesn't happen to be the case, then maybe it's time to experiment. I say it all the time with struggling teams. Don't be afraid to go beyond what you quote unquote should be playing. Try playing what you're good at. Your comfort picks might not always work, but it's always worth a shot when you're a bad team with practically no expectations at all. If the map or situation calls for it, then stick to your guns. Besides that though, there's really not much else the Valiant can do. This team was not designed for success. They're literally supposed to be bad. They won 2 maps and tied 1 across 8 matches. They have lost to everybody in the East, I believe, and every single time it was not even close. With that said, their odds of winning a game this year are grim. Let's discuss their best possible chances. Looking at their schedule for both the Summer Showdown and Countdown Cup, they have the Hunters and NYXL twice, the Dragons, the Spark, the Dynasty, and the Charge once each. Out of all of those matchups at this point in time, the only real shot is probably Guangzhou or maybe New York. I bring up the Charge and NYXL because they both have been dealing with inconsistency issues this year. New York can beat the Fusion and lose to the Charge in the same week. They're young and prone to mistakes as a result. Meanwhile, the Charge are still trying to get their feet off the ground as they can't seem to get more than one win in a stage, and sadly, they get blown out in their losses. It's a weird trend. They're clearly still trying to figure some stuff out. These are two beatable opponents under normal circumstances, but the thing is, it's the Valiant we're talking about. They're anything but normal. New York literally speed ran them the other week, and the Charge have already 3-0'd them. Even the lower tier APAC teams are clearly better, which means the Valiant do not have a great shot. Unless they get the right meta or maybe catch the right opponent off guard, their chances of winning a game are quite minimal. Much like the Dragons back in Season 1, nobody wants to be that team who loses to the Valiant. Even if the opponent doesn't gain anything by defeating them, they'd likely have to throw hard to lose to the Valiant. That's enough about the Valiant though. It's time to talk about the Vancouver Titans now, and what is there to say about this miserable group exactly? The first thing that comes to mind is that they pretty much only show competence when their opponents are not taking them seriously. Outside of that game against Paris a while back, that's what pretty much all of their games have felt like. The Titans are in a very similar place to the Valiant in terms of building a roster. It was not made in like 2 months or whatever, but they're still widely banking on a below average roster with a minuscule budget, you'd have to imagine. But why can't the Titans do anything? Why is it that only a few games on their schedule feel winnable, which we'll talk about later? Well, it comes down to not having a true foundation. Unlike London, where the team is at least comprised of academy roster players and a few veterans as well, the Titans are kind of all over the place. They lack a real identity. Unfortunately, that's not exactly something you can solve in just a few months. Besides being weird with synergy, who is this team's most reliable playmaker though? That's another identity crisis. We know who the vocal leaders of this team are, sure, but who are the real strong points in-game? Who can they lean on a fight-to-fight scenario? It feels to me like they're lacking that guy still. Even the Valiant have that going for them, kind of. There's a few guys who could become that star for the Titans, but nobody has completely stepped up yet. I think Taro's a good guy who could become that person one day. He has a lot of potential. He's shown promise on the Genji and a few glimmers of life on Echo, but he's not there yet. He's still developing. Or maybe it could be Dalton. I've always been a fan of that guy. In my opinion, the team looks better with him in the game instead of Linkser, so that's a potential place to start. If Dalton makes some plays early on, consider keeping him in the game rather than subbing in Linkser. Right now, Vancouver is going through this mini crisis where they can't seem to decide who they like better. It's one thing to have them be map specialist, but it's a completely different thing when you start one guy one week, then the other guy the next. It's kind of weird. That seems like a realistic place to start your evaluation. It's clear that a lot of potential lies within your DPS line. Now it's a matter of refining it and getting that right lineup. Their other big problem in my eyes is their general team play. The coordination is just off. This team wins fights a lot of the time because of random individual heroics rather than a solid team effort. That huge play on Genji Taro had against the Gladiator showcases this pretty perfectly, I would say. Whether it's the players not working well together, the coaches not having a good enough understanding of how to play their team effectively, or maybe a little of both, something just isn't right. In every game, basically, it has been this massive team diff. It's like their opponents are on a different plane of existence. The Vancouver tanks try to be decisive, but they get destroyed on the front lines. Sometimes they'd get away with it when playing around Shredlock, but now that he's gone, it's not really working too well. The rest of the team has to find ways to back these tanks up better. Their tanks lead the league in deaths per 10 minutes. But again, it's kind of a team issue. It goes full circle. Pretty much all of their positions are in this exact same scenario. The Vancouver Titans seriously need to sit down and think about what they want to play around. Are you interested in playing around the picks your DPS get, or is the idea to put more resources into the tanks to see what they can do? Once they figure that out, hopefully they could make some strides. I think it's possible. We've seen this team push back from time to time, but they can never finish anything off, and you can tell how frustrating it is. Imagine holding the shock from finishing a map just to get full health. That is extremely discouraging when you had a chance to push the shock and take a map off them. That gets me to my next point. Perseverance. If the Titans intend to win a game, they have to stay true to themselves. Don't let the mistakes get to you. Stay hungry. They're still incorporating a new tank into their system. That takes time, and it takes patience. And once he feels more comfortable, that means you could see some more positive results head your way. Keep your heads up, and maybe a good opportunity could present itself. But generally speaking, there's not much the Titans can do, just like with the Valiant. This team is not supposed to be competitive, and their inability to win a single map this stage shows that firsthand. Bottom feeders exist in all sports, and the Titans sadly happen to be one of those victims. Looking at their schedule now, barring any randomness that could happen, the best opportunities likely come in Week 12 against Paris if they were to show signs of regression, or against London in what would be their final week of the season. But keep in mind that this will be a full-strength London who have access to Sparker now. Vancouver also plays some mid-table NA teams along the way, like Boston, who they have twice, as well as Toronto, but that's likely just wishful thinking at this point. Vancouver avoiding the second winless season in league history could come down to their final match. Can they pull it off? Will they win a game? I would say there's a chance. It's a slight one, but it's definitely there. Vancouver pulled off some upset magic last year, so maybe they can do it again. Plus, like I said before, London and Paris could be winnable. It's not impossible, but they'll surely need a few things to go their way if they want to pull it off. That's all I've got for Vancouver. It's your turn, London. Just like Vancouver, they're rocking that -20 map differential on the year, which means they're in a tie for last place in the West. The June Joust saw them run into a lot of tough opponents, so putting up a good fight was not likely. You might even consider giving them a chance or some sort of pass for the June Joust because of it. They played far better in what you'd consider to be their winnable matchups during the May Melee. With their schedule having more of these winnable games in the second half of the season, maybe there's still hope. Before getting into what games they could win, we gotta talk about what has gone wrong so far. For starters, they aren't quite good enough at the standard meta. On some characters and compositions they're forced to play a lot of, many of their players see a decrease in production. Their playstyle clearly does not mesh as well with certain characters as they do with others. What they need to do is work on that flexibility because the team as a whole is suffering. Whether it's a coaching thing, a player thing, maybe a little bit of both, they have to learn and adapt. Take Kelix, for example. He was a guy many people had concerns about heading into Season 4. If you look at how he's performed so far, it makes a lot of sense. His consistency depends widely on the meta, which is obviously a problem when you're the only main support on your team. Brig has played a pivotal role in this year's meta, but Kelix has struggled on her. Having one of the lowest healing rates with one of the highest death rates is not a good sign. If he was at least doing a good amount of damage and keeping that Inspire passive up, it wouldn't be as bad, but he's not doing much of that at all. What makes the situation so weird is that Kelix has not been underperforming all the time. It's been a Lucio and Brig thing for him, which just so happen to be the two most popular main support heroes of the year so far. When he's gotten the chance to play Mercy though, it's totally different. He goes from one of the worst statistically to the lowest death rate and the highest healing per 10 on that hero in the league. And it's not like he's only played her once or twice. We're talking almost 2 hours of gameplay. The moment he gets to play more passively, the production seems to skyrocket. Maybe that's a sign that some of these style differences within the team need to be worked on, because a very similar thing also plays out with Ripa when you compare his BAP to his Ana and Zen, let's say, where he fights at more of a distance. Let's look at another example from a different position though, just to further prove this point. Take a look at Hadi. Back when Reinhardt was heavily involved in this meta, he saw very little production. His deaths per 10 currently rank tied for second at 7.8. Side note, in a lot of instances, the tanks can only do so much on a struggling team. If everyone else is also having a tough time, naturally they're going to become the punching bags of their enemies. But with Hadi in particular, I feel a part of it is on him as well. Now maybe it's just me, but Hadi feels like the type of tank who likes to go aggro. He tends to be near the top of the leaderboards on main tank heroes when it comes to average damage per 10. He's clearly a big contributor for his team. They depend on him. Back to what I was saying though. Hadi took a beating on Reinhardt, which is kind of strange when you consider his higher levels of productivity on Winston and Orisa, aka two heroes who saw more playtime in the June Joust. That seems kind of weird when you consider that London played worse during this period of time. Look at the statistics for his combined Orisa and Winston stats during the June Joust. 5.8 deaths per 10 is not far off from the likes of Smurf. He's middle of the pack, and his damage rate, it's through the roof. That gets me back into the style thing that I brought up with Kellex. There seems to be some miscommunication going on. There has not been nearly enough follow-up when the tanks engage. If Hadi is putting in all this work, why is it not leading to a higher rate of one-team fights? Well, it might have to do with his aggressiveness. Molfig has been forced to be all over the place because of it. Because he has to be so aggressive with Hadi, but also help his backline, his death toll is one of the highest among all off-tanks. The tanks are going super aggro now, but they aren't getting the kills fast enough for it to even matter. Could that maybe have to do with the DPS? Possibly. Let's take a look at Blase. In my opinion, his Echo, it's been pretty decent on the surface. He's been a fairly good contributor, and he's not even dying that much either. But if you think about it, that might be an issue. That might be an indicator that he's not aggressive enough because he's not dying enough. The low damage per 10 would certainly suggest this as well, I feel. It may seem weird to think about it, but I mean, seriously, if you're dying way less on average than most of the other players on your team, but you're also doing a below average amount of damage on like Echo, let's say, then yeah, maybe you could be doing more. Maybe you could be on like the front lines more, or just like trying to coordinate more with your tanks, I guess. I'm not exactly sure how to put it, but I think you kind of get what I mean. The DPS and tanks might not entirely be on the same page. If you ask me, London either have to get even more aggressive, or they have to tone it down. Who can more easily change their style of play? That's the real question. Once they figure that out, adjust accordingly. If I'm London, I would lean towards the passive route if you're looking to avoid going winless at least. Play more disciplined than the opposition when you're playing a team around your skill level. It's clear that more players on this team would benefit from this type of style. Blase and the supports enjoy it. If you're in a Tracer meta, let's say, maybe you could be a bit more aggro since that's how Shaxx likes to play, but you could always convince him to slow down the pace a bit. Sure, it's not a style that he'll be his absolute best on, but you have to remember, he's not on the Valiant anymore. He can't do the same types of things. He has to adapt and change to this new team, this new situation. So, maybe he should slow down too. Maybe slowing down is the key for this entire team. The supports and Blase feel more comfortable, maybe Shaxx goes down a bit less, then Molfig feels less pressure due to Hadi being less aggro. But of course, this is all a lot easier said than done, and I'm just an armchair analyst at the end of the day. This is just a theory on what I think could work. It doesn't mean it will. A general team diff is something they will have to deal with this entire year. It likely won't be going away anytime soon. Just changing your style might not be enough, sadly, especially when you are lacking a second consistent playmaker at DPS. I mentioned Shaxx having ups and downs before, but it's not just him. Hybrid's productivity has come in spurts. Some moments he lands a lot of his shots on the hit scan roll, but in others he fails to leave much of an impression. Hit scan has been problematic for the Spitfire, and again, a large part of it has to do with the team being half aggressive and half passive. Somebody like Hybrid does a fair amount of damage on the Ashe, for example, but also gets picked off a ton in return. If Hybrid or Shaxx could be a bit more on the same page with everybody else, maybe DPS could be a bit less problematic. But thankfully, another solution has recently presented itself, potentially a better solution for that matter. Their other hitscan player, Sparker, has finally turned 18. Maybe plugging him into the starting lineup will be the key. Now, I haven't watched as much Sparker as some of you Tier 2 enthusiasts out there, but I made sure to study up on British Hurricane coming into Season 4, and I have to say, Sparker was a standout player during my film sessions. He's an explosive and talented young player filled to the brim with potential. Now, of course, it'll take more than just a new DPS player to solve this team's problems in the long term. But in the short term, he could help make some meaningful progress in terms of more competitive sets and winning a few games. Sparker could inspire the rest of his teammates. Leading by example could give this team some well-needed energy and inspiration. They're down in the dumps, and they really do need a hero. London came close to winning a few games during the May Melee. Some extra firepower could be the thing to push them over the top next time they find themselves in one of those games that slips away when it's right in their hands. That's about everything I have to say for London and their situation and how it could resolve, so how about we take a look at their remaining schedule? As I alluded to earlier, there's a couple of good opportunities. Right off the bat, at the start of Week 11, they have Paris. The Eternal have been improving fast, so London surely will be the underdogs heading into it, but that does not mean they can't win. Paris are not unbeatable. If they come in with a fresh mindset with Sparker hopefully playing, it just might be an interesting game. And to make things even more intriguing, they have Paris again in the final week of the season, so they get 2 cracks at an opponent they certainly could defeat if improvements are made. Speaking of that final week, like I was talking about with Vancouver, they play the Titans the following day in that last week. Just like how I said with the Titans, the same applies for London. This might be their best possible opportunity to win a game. It's not by much, but I'd probably favor London over Vancouver thanks to their superior synergy and higher potential. Now that I'm thinking about it, there's probably one other game that's borderline winnable. That would probably be Toronto in Week 17, given that they played them so well during the May Melee, but that one's kind of a long shot. So pretty much half of their schedule is worth feeling somewhat optimistic about moving forward. I'm hoping it doesn't come down to that Vancouver game, but if it does, they should at least be favored. Now let's talk about who has the greatest chance of avoiding a winless season. For me, it's gotta be the Spitfire. I have more faith in their roster, and their schedule is a bit lighter in the second half of the season. I would argue they win at least once out of their 2 meetings with Paris and that one game with Vancouver. They have the best number of opportunities and the strongest roster out of the 3 remaining winless teams. They edge out the Titans by a small margin. I kind of just gave it away, but that means my team with the second highest odds of winning a game is the Titans. It's not by much, but my level of faith in them is stronger than the Valiant. The Titans at least have a few somewhat established pieces, you know? The Valiant, it's basically just Crystal and Molon Run plus some occasional contributions from the off-tank and flex support positions. My hopes are greater for the likes of Dalton, Changsik, Fried Wiener, Fire, and Teru. They're all capable of being respectable. Neither one of them have all that favorable of a schedule, but Vancouver at least has opportunities with Paris and London. The Valiant don't have such a team unless they can suddenly catch up to the charge. It's impossible to say for certain who will and who won't win a game this season, but it's kind of crazy to realize we realistically could have 2 of these 3 franchises go winless, which would be history in itself. It's quite the fall from grace for any of these teams. London would go from Season 1 champions to 0-16 with a completely different roster. The Valiant would go from 2018 Stage 4 champions and multiple top 10 finishes in the standings to winless, with all respect for their org being non-existent, at least for the Western fanbase. In the Titans, they transform from a Season 2 runner-up and Stage 1 champion to a bottom team with less wins in the last 2 seasons combined than they got in Season 2. Time sure does do crazy things, huh? Things have changed a lot since the league first began, and I'm sure more teams will either take a fall from grace or finally turn the page in the future. Now I turn the conversation over to you though. How are you feeling about the Spitfire, Titans, and the Valiant? How many of them will go winless, if any at all? Who's going to be the ones to avoid going winless? And what do you think these teams need to do in order to improve during the second half of the season? Leave a comment down below, and let's get this discussion going. If you want more of these types of reflection videos in the future, give this video a like and subscribe to stay up to date with all of my content. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.